Hello guys, today we'll be talking about services in Laravel. So how to call service classes, how to create them, how to use them. And recently I've tweeted asking you to share some examples of how you use services. And I've got 3 examples for you today. So first I will show you the simple way how to use services for just simple actions. Then the more complex way to use services, kind of like repositories, and we will discuss that. And then third example will be really complex application with a lot of layers, including services. So let's dive in. The first example, here's the controller code for store method where split cost service is called. And usually I see 2 examples of how services are being used. First example is to manipulate some data, so perform some calculations in the service method and return back the result. So just kind of a black box to perform some operation with data manipulation. And this is exactly this example. Another example, which we'll see in a minute, is performing some actions in a service. Split cost service has a method of split cost with request as a parameter. It takes the request, performs some manipulations, some splitting the data, and returns compact, so returns the array of data pilot and data copilot, and then that data later in the controller is being used for other stuff. So this is a good example of a so-called black box. So basically, if you have a method to perform something with request, you create a separate class, call it something service, in app services folder with app services namespace, and just call it from the controller, initializing that service just in time when you need it. So you don't do any injections anywhere. You just create service object, call the method, and go on with your life. I have one comment, however, in this case, what I dislike here in the service, that the service catches the exception. So there is a try catch block in the service method. And if something goes wrong, although it's hard to imagine what could go wrong in just performing the request assigning operations, but anyway, if something goes wrong, then return back. So in my opinion, in my experience, that black box service should not perform anything with web requests. It should not redirect something, it should not abort 404, it should just return the result to the controller, and then controller performs anything related to web operations. So if anything, service should throw an exception, not catch it. So if something goes wrong here, exception is thrown, and then try catch is inside of the controller, not inside of the service. So I would do try catch here. So try something, and then if something goes wrong, then catch here. So service is about the data and about the action with that data, but not about redirecting or anything with web requests. Let's take a look at another example within the same repository. Another store method in another controller, and this is an example how services can be used with checking something or with performing some operation. And general purpose of services is to make the controllers shorter. So if the contents of those methods would be in the controller would be too long and harder to read. And in this case, controller is really easy to read. If availability, then we create something and redirect back. Otherwise, we redirect that something is not available. Really readable. And again, you create the service, initialize whenever you need that. So no injections or anything more complex. Let's take a look what is here. If availability check passed, so database query to check something and then return true or return false, and also try catch, same thing, I dislike that. It should return true or false, this method. But generally it's the same black box method of getting the data from the service. Another service, however, is a different example. So the second one, booking status service creates status, and it actually creates the data. So it performs saving the data for the booking and then returns true. This is maybe a questionable thing what to return, but since the result of that service isn't used anywhere, it just should return true or false. It's okay. But again, try catch, I would throw it out. So that was the first project example, really simple, calling the service, getting the result, and that's it. Let's take a look at the second project, a bit more complex. The second project, and let's start from a simple example of that project with a different way to initialize the service. So if you create a service, for example, coupon service in the same app services folder, you can initialize it by type hinting like this. So you don't need to call new coupon service. Laravel will initialize it for you if you type hint it, and then inside of the controller method, you can just call the actual service method. In this case, however, I'm not sure about the structure of the service. So there is a coupon list, which is here, and then inside of that index blade, jQuery data tables are used, and then there's an AJAX request to return the actual result of the data table, which then is called here, And then there's that service to return just data table result like this. So result of that is JSON of that data table package, well-known data table package, which we use inside of our quick admin panel, and it works well. But to create a separate service and then do it inside of that app services coupon, so subfolder with one service, with one method, not sure. I would probably restructure that into data table service, because I see there's also package service, which does the same thing, data table of packages, which is actually pretty similar to that one. So I would use probably data table service with method package data table, coupon data table, something like that. Because if the service is called coupon service, I expect that it works with coupons in general. Some create coupon, check if it's available, check the amount of available coupons, something like that. Package service, as the name, it kind of tells me that it works with packages. But actually both of them work with data table. So it is kind of like a data table service. That's how I would structure that. And now let's take a look at a more complex example, which looks like a service, but actually it's not a service. It's a design pattern called repository pattern. And I have a separate video. Pretty recently I've shot a video that you should not use repository pattern and call it a service instead. And this example is 180 degrees in the opposite direction. This developer calls it a service, but actually it's a repository. And it's not fully implemented yet, but structurally I will explain it. So if you take a look at the controller of booking controller, it is injected in the constructor of the full controller class with the thought that you will use it in the methods of that controller, which is cool. So we have this payment service, and then in the controller we have payment service charge. Now let's dig deeper. What is a payment service? Payment service is actually a payment contract, which is an interface. So if we take a look at the payment contract, it's an interface, it's not a class, interface with one method. And then there is a file, repository service provider. It was created manually, so you can create any service providers in your application and then call them from config app. So there should be probably repository service provider like this. You just add your service provider in the list of providers. And then in that service provider, you can bind a specific repository class to specific interface. So this line means that payment contract is resolved by card repository. Let's take a look what is in card repository. Card repository, it's a class with charge method to be implemented later. Okay, fine. I told you it's not implemented yet, but structurally it's a good path to follow. What could be another repository, you would ask? Payment, PayPal repository, which is also to be implemented later. But basically that means that every repository has to obey the rules of the interface of the contract, which is one method charge. And whenever you want to switch the repository here, you don't change anything in the controller. That should still work. You just change in your provider, in repository service provider, or wherever you bind that, you change that payment contract, should be resolved with PayPal repository from now on. So this is a good example of repositories, which is two classes of the same interface, which could be changed. Although in this example, this developer may have trouble to actually implement charge in the same way with card and with PayPal, because the flow of the payment may be different. So it's really hard to create such interface that would be identical in all the repositories, which is like card, PayPal, it may be in the future Bitcoin, whatever. So if you structure your code with repository, you have to be really aware of what you're doing and what could be the methods and what could be the repeating parts. And our third example is actually public. So you can take a look at the full project, which is Send Portal for self-hosted email marketing solutions. It has its own website, and it can be installed as a package into your Laravel application, or it can be used as a standalone software. So let's take a look what's inside of that source, and part of that is services. And it has a pattern of both services and repositories. So the things that we've discussed previously, I'm kind of growing in this video with more complex stuff, and what we just discussed in the services and repositories in another project, it is implemented here, and let's take a look how exactly. So in the import controller, we have a service type hinted and injected in the constructor, and usually that is done not to replace the service like repository, but mostly to have this subscriber service for whatever methods are inside. So if you have 5 methods in the controller, instead of initializing and creating new object every time, you have this subscriber service, which you can use wherever in that controller. And if we search for that subscriber service in the whole class, we have this. So this subscriber service import. What is import? It's a method inside of that subscriber service. Let's scroll up. And here we see an interesting thing. So service uses repository pattern. So there's another layer, controller, then service, and inside of that service, we see subscriber tenant repository interface. And in here, the naming is really good. So I know that this is an interface. It's not a service, it's not a repository, it's an interface. So if we click and take a look what's inside, there are 4 methods inside of that interface of subscriber tenant repository. And let's take a look if we search through all the project where it is bound. It's in the service provider, so send portal app service provider, and all the repositories are bound here, including the subscriber repository. And this is a good example where you can see different repositories of the same interface. So if we use Postgres, there is a repository for Postgres subscribers, which uses DB table and probably doesn't use Eloquent because Postgres has some different syntax. That thing, to char, probably it's Postgres only. And if we take a look at MySQL repository, we probably will not see that to char. Yep, so date format. Yeah, that's the actual difference. So date format is in MySQL, and in Postgres, it's to char. So that's a good example of repository with interface with exact implementation. And again, that repository is public. This one, and I will link that in the description of this video. So these are my 3 code reviews, you may call them, or just examples of services. But along the way, we touched repositories as well, and at the end, even more about repositories. So I hope you understand the difference. So in short, service in any PHP class, which you put in app services, you initialize that in the controller and call it. If you want more complex structure, you could use repositories or any other patterns, but generally services is probably the most simple thing to offload from your controller to somewhere else to perform some operations and make the controllers shorter. If you want more reviews on this channel about some topic, shoot in the comments below your ideas and I will take a look. And subscribe to the channel because there are new videos daily now, and support the channel financially by checking out one of the 3 products which you can see on the screen. One of the products is actually my courses, and one of the courses is how to structure Laravel projects. It's an old course, but it's like 95% still relevant. And I talk about services and repositories there as well, so you may check that out. And see you guys in other videos.